This is the Other 22 Hours podcast. Hey, and welcome to this week's episode of the Other 22 Hours podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Schaefer-Hayes.
And I'm your other host, Michaela Ann, and we are on episode 112. And this week, we're featuring our conversation with Drew Holcomb.
Drew Holcomb is a singer and songwriter originally from Memphis that now calls Nashville home. He tours and releases records under his band, Drew Holcomb and the Neighbors. And he just released a duets record with his wife, who is also a singer-songwriter named Ellie Holcomb. Drew started releasing solo records back in 2005, releasing a handful of records independently before signing with Dualtone Records and releasing one record with them until the president, the late Paul Roper, approached Drew and said, you know, your team and your management have the capacity to release records on your own. So we're happy to release your records, but you could kind of do this on your own, which is an amazing thing for a record company president to say. So with that, Drew took that advice and went back to being independent, releasing it with his team under Magnolia Records. And it wasn't until 2011 that he had really a single that resonated with people on the national scale. And as he said, that's what started his career.
Yeah, and since then he has continued to release, I think, almost over a dozen records. He has started the Magnolia Record Club, which we didn't even get to talk about, but is a really awesome human-curated record club. It feels like old-fashioned. I remember
Columbia House. I want to pay 99 cents to get 12 records.
Yeah, I remember we did that when I was a kid, and I remember looking through the CDs and being so excited. But Drew has also toured with Susan Tedeschi, Lobos, Avett Brothers, John Hiatt, many, many more, as well as written songs with McKenna, Natalie Hemby, Zach Williams from the Lone Bellow.
Drew's a really grounded, real person, and you kind of hear that throughout this conversation as we touch on things like chasing the song rather than chasing the business. He says that that's something that he wished he knew earlier on in his career. It was really that big song in 2011 that he released that kind of taught him about that. You know, one thing that I really love is he says that he loves getting a solid answer, whether that's yes or no, from his publicist or his agent. I just want to know. I don't want to hear I'm working on this if the person has just said it's not a good fit. Tell me no, and let's move on.
We also talk about learning that big names in this business don't necessarily equal big returns. I feel like this conversation also highlights some of my biggest learning lessons from that stuff.
So if you listen to these conversations like people watch NASCAR where you are just waiting for the crash, this conversation definitely has some moments of that was an expensive learning lesson from both Michaela and Drew. But as always, there are some topics in this conversation that come as direct suggestions from our Patreon community. And that's because they get advance notice of our guests. They can ask questions. They can give areas that they would like us to touch on. And it's also the only way to directly support the production of our show. So if that sounds interesting to you, there is a link below in the show notes.
And if you're a visual person, this and all of our past conversations are available on YouTube. So without further ado, here is our conversation with Drew Holcomb. So we usually just like to start with a really general question of how are you today and where are you in your creative path?
Well, you're catching me at a strange time because I'm sort of on the downhill of the flu. Yeah. So I've had 3 days of basically sitting around wishing I could be working, but not having the energy to. And I woke up this morning feeling a little better. So that's exactly where I'm at today. Yeah, as far as where I'm in the creative cycle, I mean, Ellie and I, my wife, we just did a duets record, which is a first for us, even though we've been married for almost 20 years. She's an artist as well. And that was an incredibly fulfilling experience. It was a record that was written in a very short time frame, basically a matter of 3 weeks. We wrote 10 songs and then recorded them in a similar fashion, sort of over the course of just a week, tracked live in a studio, Nashville Sound Emporium. And then we did about 35 shows, which we still have 3 or 4 of those left. And since then, kind of in between the recording and the touring, I've been just doing a little bit of spot writing. I'm writing with some younger artists, sometimes for them, sometimes for myself. We wrote a song for a TV show called House of David that was kind of fun to write and record. But I'm in a bit of a sort of gathering phase. That's kind of how I write, is listening to a lot of music, getting newspapers and collecting words and phrases and just gathering all the tools for writing a record. Typically the way I start writing, and then once I have 3 or 4 songs that I'm really confident are going to make a record, then I'll put 2 weeks in the studio on the calendar 6 months from now, and then force myself to write the rest of the record sort of in the in-between time. And I'm not quite to that spot yet. I've also put out 3 records in 3 years. So I'm kind of enjoying a little bit of deep breath space from writing and recording.
Yeah. I love that idea of just putting dates in the calendar and holding your foot to the flame. You know, I heard somebody say it was in regards to like running races or something like that, but the saying like sign up first, you know, because like getting started is the hardest thing. So it's like sign up and then you kind of have to figure out how to make it happen.
You know, everybody's different. Some people don't enjoy that kind of pressure. I do. I don't write every day. I don't even really write every week. So it's good for me to put a goal on the calendar. So it sort of forces the issue.
Yeah. I noticed for me, like when I have a deadline like that, it almost allows me to see the work that I'm doing and what I'm creating like in a more objective light. It's like, is this good? You know, am I just attached to like the feeling that I had while I was writing this and making this, or does this actually stand up? You know, there's no time to just be like, oh, I'll just sit with it and massage it. And, you know, it's like, no, really, is this going to work or is this for the next one?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I don't know if you guys feel this way, but I'd say 85% of my work is done sort of in the frame of a full album. Mm-hmm. I've definitely had some one-off recordings and a couple of those a year, but primarily I write and then record a proper record. And I can look back at my career, and I don't want to name names of the songs necessarily, but I look back at every single record, and there's always a song that looking back on it, I'm like, you know what? That one probably should not have made the record.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
I feel like I'm very album centric. I like hearing when writers say, you know, I don't write every day, because I feel like, especially moving to Nashville, if you're like dipping your toes ever in the publishing world, they have that whole like, you should be writing every day. And I just have not found that is natural to me, and also is not suitable to my life, especially when you're juggling other aspects of music like touring and recording. I love the conversations of hearing people's natural pace who also have managed to still build a career on it. Because our first daughter was born, I didn't write a song for like 2 years. And now I just wrote a song last week and that I actually like, but it had been a year before that. And I've learned to like accept that, but I'd love to hear more about how much you like are able to let life lead your pacing, and how much is sometimes driven by, man, I need to get a new record out.
It's a great question. I don't necessarily know that I intentionally think about it in a way that like, oh man, I've got to make a record. But there's definitely comes a time for me where I look and I go, okay, it's been quite a while. I have this job and I have this mortgage and I have these kids and I need to make another record. And so that said, I also find myself finding like a balance between intentionally putting time on the schedule to create and write, but then also allowing myself when the muse hits to start writing. I mean, my latest song that I've been working on is, this is silly, but you'll appreciate it. I love old cars, and I'm on this email list called Bring a Trailer, and it's like a auction site for cars. I've never bought anything on there, but I have a 71 Bronco, so I'm sort of in the vintage car world. And this email came to me from them that Cormac McCarthy's 90s Ferrari was for sale. And I was like, Cormac McCarthy's Black Ferrari. That's a song.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting there on the couch, like checking email in the middle of a Sunday morning. So it was Saturday. We were late for a soccer game because I started writing this song. So I got the guitar off the wall and started coming up with this idea. And my son was watching Saturday morning cartoons. And so in the background of my voice memo, you can hear my son talking about, hey, Dad, did you see the dinosaur or whatever? And I'm like, yeah, that's great, buddy. And then back to my little melody. And so I still feel responsible to sort of chase down those moments. Mm-hmm. But typically what happens is I get something started, then I have to push pause, and then I go back when I have time blocked and finish it. I feel like there's still a lot of spontaneity in the collecting of ideas, the collecting of words, phrases, rhythmic ideas. But then the actual, what I've found since post-kids, my oldest is 12, so this is now basically all I remember, is having to put intentional creative time on the calendar. But then I think having a little bit of a loose hand with my expectations of that time. So if I sit down to write and I'm just not in a space, or I'm exhausted, or I'm frustrated about some other thing, or there's some external thing happening that's kind of ruining the energy of creativity, I'll kind of have mercy on myself. You know what? Today's not the day, but I'm going to put another block on the schedule within the next few days to try to resurrect that time. So for me, it's a mixture of both. But the longest time I went without writing was the beginning of COVID. I didn't write for like 8 or 9 months, which for me is a really long time.
Yeah.
I think part of it was I love writing for the audience. Like I'm massively disagree with Rick Rubin about his whole take on never consider the audience. I disagree with that completely. So when I didn't have an audience at all, or it kind of took the wind out of my sails, but eventually I got over it.
I'm curious. I wish I could ask Rick Rubin to expand on that, because also coming from, he's a producer, but he's not a live performer.
Well, he's not even a musician, really.
Yeah. But it is such a relationship that I think there can be this idea of a sense of purity if you're not thinking about the audience, that I think is a bit naive. I don't know. You could frame it like having more ego or less ego to not be considering the audience when you're writing. But I think even if you're writing from a place that's a really personal place and trying to convey a story that you really want to write, you can still be thinking of your audience, especially if you have an audience that you know. And depending on what type of artist you are, you probably have gotten to know who your audience is in a lot of ways. So I like that. I feel like we haven't ever talked about that somehow on this podcast, the relationship of thinking about the audience when we're writing, not necessarily okay, I'm going to write something that I think that they're going to like, but can you maybe expand a little more on how you think of them when you're writing?
Sure. And I think maybe sometimes it can be confused about, maybe he's talking about when he says, don't think about the audience, don't think about the commercial response. If that's what he means, then I'm certainly in agreement with him. Considering the reality that music listeners, music consumers, fans, however you want to sort of frame the word audience, these are people with stories. These are people with heartbreaks and triumphs and all the spectrum between joy and tragedy in their own complex lives. Mm-hmm. And music, for whatever reason, has this sort of supernatural, magical ability to connect people to themselves and to each other. To me, the beauty of music is that it sort of reveals something to ourselves about our own lives, about our own pain, about our own joy. And so I think I need to write in such a way that I treat that audience member, that person listening, with a little bit of respect, not with sort of disdain at worst, or apathy at least. I think either one of those sort of postures is a miss, because your audience is going to listen to this and tell their own story, whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. That said, if you also sort of spoon feed them and tell them exactly how to feel, exactly how to respond, I think that's a bit lazy as well. So I'm always trying to figure out, especially to put together a whole record, I want to make sure that I'm considering the sort of roller coaster of emotions that life really is. And if I'm only going to put a record out every 18 to 30 months, I want to take people on a journey. I want them to feel joy and excitement and get in the car and drive. And I also want them to sort of get inside their feelings alone and dig into their stories and their past, their dreams, dreams realized, dreams not realized. The only reason I have this job is because I have an audience. So I think it would be disrespectful not to sort of honor that.
Yeah, absolutely. I hear you saying kind of what I feel is having and holding respect for the audience, understanding that they're there, you are with them. We went to jazz school in New York City, and I came up deep, and I thought for a while I wanted to be a jazz drummer and all of that. And then getting into downtown New York, jazz scene is very intellectual. And I would argue with anybody that those artists, being incredibly prolific musicians and really gifted and really talented, they very quickly forgot about their audience in a sense. And the music that they made was so technical and so complex. It was kind of like reading some really in-depth medical journal where you needed an 8-year degree to understand what you were looking at, which maybe that is the audience that they were writing for, but it can very quickly lose your audience. To me, that then it loses the impact. We had Roseanne Cash on here, and she paraphrased Bob Dylan on people go to a performance not to feel the artist's emotions, but to feel their own emotions.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, music's role in their life is it's basically they're finding an expression, a way into their emotions that they don't necessarily have themselves. Maybe they don't know how to play an instrument or write a song or sing, but they take on the moment and the mythology of the music to their own stories and their own lives. And that's why music connects and has this incredible relationship to human beings, is because everybody, whether they can do it or not, they can sort of see themselves in the music or feel themselves in the music. That's a great quote. I mean, that's definitely been true for me as a fan. Mm-hmm. It's what led me to music in the first place. So I hope that's true with how people experience what I make.
Yeah. I mean, I think we can go down a total armchair psychology analysis of the whole thing. It's well, isn't any relationship that you hold in life really just your own reaction to your own feelings? Mm-hmm. It's sure. I like this person because I feel really comfortable around them. I feel welcome. I feel open.
Yeah, nobody's a silo. Like, it's all in reflection and relationship to each other, the people that we interact with, the people that we love, like how we come up and feel about ourselves. I think about this a lot, having a second child. And it was such a debate of, are we going to have a second kid? Because it's hard to be a touring musician and have children at all. But I think about that, how your sense of self is determined by who is around you. And I grew up with a brother, and Aaron is an only child. And so much of my identity was also informed by what I was or wasn't, like in comparison to my brother, and not necessarily negative in any way, but none of us are in a vacuum. So it's in every aspect of our life. It's all interconnected.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about, so am I correct in my understanding that you put out some records with Dualtone and then started your own label and have been putting out records on your own label since then? Many, many records since then?
Yeah, well, actually, the first 2 records I put out were on my own as well. And then I put out 1 record with Dualtone. And then around that same time, I started working with my current manager, and he and his wife, who also is a manager with the same company, had put out a lot of great records on their own. Folks like Green River Ordinance and Ben Rector. And so Paul Roper at Dualtone, who we all miss dreadfully, what an amazing guy. He basically pulled me aside and he's like, look, we can do another record with you if you want to. He said, but your team is well poised to do this without us if you're willing to take the risk. And so that was a nice blessing to get from him. And that's basically what we've done. I mean, I did multiple records on my own. I did 1 record as a distribution deal with 30 Tigers. But yeah, we've basically done it ourselves. And, it started out when I was young as a necessity because none of the labels would sign me because I was sort of a square peg in a round hole. Mm-hmm. But I had an audience, so I knew that I wanted to put music out. But it's been a really great thing for me within the sort of genre space that I'm in, which is somewhere between kind of AAA and Americana, folk pop kind of world. And it's also been very scary at times because I'm now at a point where when I really record a record because of previous success, I'm not really getting any deals anymore from, the team involved, relatively speaking. So, and radio campaigns and publicity and videos, they're expensive. And so sometimes every time I put out a record, I'm making a $100,000, $200,000 bet on us and our business. And that's a big swing.
Yep.
And now with the way streaming works, the money comes in, but it comes in over a long period of time. And so thankfully our touring helps that. We've been lucky to be successful on that front, and sync has been good for us as well. Yeah, we've been able to stay independent and grateful for that. I know that's not everybody's story and have that sort of nerve capacity.
Yeah.
And there's some great labels out there that do a good job, Dualtone being one of them. But that's been our journey.
We've had quite a few conversations on here about how moving to independence affects your creativity in the writing and the making of the records. You've released so many records with your team kind of independently. Can you talk about how the changing landscape has changed like your guys' creativity in the way that you market the records and put out the records? Like how you spend on videos, how you spend on, do you spend on a publicist? Do you, obviously we know you spend on a publicist because that's how we are sitting here, but I'd love to hear about, like, since it is such a business that you run on this, like, how has your creativity around that business changed with the changing landscape of income and unsettledness of all of that?
Yeah, I can kind of look back at the different decision points, mainly about how to release music. So I've been at it now for 20 years. So when I started out, it was still only basically CDs. And then there was a lot of fear around iTunes devaluing, people aren't going to spend $12 on a record CD anymore. They're going to only pay $1 for the song. And then obviously that worked out really well for artists for a minute. And then when streaming came along, the same thing, everybody's holding their albums back from streaming. And then obviously streaming sort of worked out well for those of us who own our own records, if you're able to build an audience of some scale over a long period of time. But the cash flows on those differences were very interesting and different and caused for consternation. I mean, it's interesting. I was reading through, like, what do I do with the other 22 hours? I mean, I spend a good bit of them, 4 or 5 hours a day running this business, looking at budgets for shows and talking to set list and talking with my insurance guy about, are we covered for this festival that we just got booked for, and bus quotes. And I'm not doing any of that alone. I've got a tour manager and I've got a manager back home who helps. And, the Publicist thing is a great story for me because when I was younger, is around a record called Good Light, which would have been 2013. which was my first record that really connected on a broad national level. Part of it was because of Sync, and part of it was just touring. We were out with Need to Breathe for the first sort of big national support look that we got. But I had seen all these peers of mine, which a lot of us do. We look around, and it's really hard not to compare yourself, right? Especially when you're young and you're not totally confident in who you are yet. And they were all using one of these 2 or 3 big publicity firms. And I was like very much determined that was what we were missing, was we didn't have one of these big ticket publicists getting us on late night TV or getting us on these, whatever, all these different things. So we got signed up with one. They took us reluctantly and gave us their newest, most green person. It was costing us like $3,500 a month. It was a 6-month minimum. And like a month in, this young publicist was like telling us about all the things she was working on and getting us. And none of it was real. It was all like smoke and mirrors. And I went to New York to meet with her. And it's the first time I met her in person. I'd only met her on the phone. Immediately knew, man, I should have come up here and met with her first because I knew this was a mistake. Meanwhile, a friend of mine had started working with Sue, who I've been now with for almost 12 years, I think. And not as big of a name in the Americana space at the time. But it was a $20,000 mistake. It was a really hard lesson to learn, that it's much better to have someone who actually loves and cares about your music and is willing to go to the mat for it than to have a brand associated with it just because you think that brand can get things done just because of the name on the flagpole. And that's been my lesson in general, is it's way less about the name of the firms you work with or the radio company you work with or even the booking agency that you have or the whatever. If you have any of that, it's more about having somebody in that position that believes in your music and believes in you and is willing to fight for you. For instance, with Sue, she's like, what's important to you? And I said, well, I'd love to get these things, but more than that, I'd love to get a clear yes or no. I can handle a no. If you pitch it to somebody and they say, this is not for us, don't tell me that you're working on it. Just say they don't want it. And then you go, okay, got it. That's clear. Same thing with radio. Same thing with talking to other managers about, man, I'd really love to go on tour with so-and-so. And they're like, yeah, we pitch it to them. They're not interested. Great. We can move on from that, you know? And I think it's hard as a creative when you experience rejection because it feels like a soul rejection less than just oh, they don't like my product. It's like, no, they don't like me. They don't love my very being.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's easy to get wrapped up in the disappointment of that. But it's also, I think, teaches you some lessons about not putting all of your sort of value in the commercial response to your music. If I could give any younger folks advice, I would just tell them, cherish the notes you get from people about how a song touched them and throw away the commercial rejections from your brain. Well, it's hard when you have bills to pay, but at the same time, that's kind of a mental health survival path.
Yeah. That's why we have this podcast, because we've been in this business for 15 plus years now, and all of our friends, all our community are all musicians, and we've seen enough of ups and downs. People have their big year, their down year, and just how important it is to continually hear even our favorite musicians also have been rejected. And
for sure,
still hear no. And because I think it's so crazy, especially with social media, your mind can play tricks on you that you're just like, even though I logically know it, I still will have days where I'm like, this is only hard for me. Like,
yeah, it's lonely sometimes.
Yeah, I'm rejected by the entire world. Like, it sounds so silly, but those are the type of thoughts that can come into our mind. And I think in that, thank you for sharing all that, because I feel like that is such a constant reminder we need, as well as dispelling the myth that getting the stamp of approval from the big firm, the big agent, whatever, actually isn't the key. Like, sometimes, yes, but I've learned that lesson. I had the owner of a very reputable big agency take me on and blow smoke up my ass and tell me how great I was and I'm the next Patty Griffin, all this stuff. And then I got pregnant and all of a sudden he wouldn't talk to me. So, you know, like had big firms, like all of that stuff, and have learned that lesson over and over again of, oh, that's not the key. The key is the person I'm working with. Do they actually want to know who I am as an artist? And do they feel passionate about specifically my thing and understand it enough to convey it to the people that they need to be pitching? Or am I just one more name that they're taking in and will eventually become an inconvenience?
You have these big agencies that have such a history of getting artists things, and some of your favorite artists have been represented by them, and you say they get this and this and this. And it's this double-edged sword of, when you talk to them, they're really good at selling things, so they can sell you on what they can get you, which is, okay, great. This publicist is great at selling things, or agency, whatever it is. But at the same time, I think it's finding somebody that is smaller, somebody that is thinking creatively as you are thinking about making your music. How creatively can we get this out there, and how can we be agile? And in my experience, I've never released my own record on a level that would need a publicist or anything. It's always been in reaction to getting a placement or something like that. But what I've observed in other people is when they go with some of these bigger agencies that have a history, and I don't mean this to come off as like me completely poo-pooing large agencies. I guess like what you're looking for, in my judgment, is somebody that doesn't have blinders on like, this is what works, this is what we do, this is the form, because it's never going to be that. I want somebody that's like, this has worked before, but maybe it doesn't work now. Let's try something new. Let's keep throwing paint at the wall and keep finding out. Which brings me to like, I loved hearing you say you want a definitive answer, because like in a way a no is a yes. Because like when you're trying to find something that works, if you have a definitive no, you're like, great, that means all of this other stuff, I don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, I don't have to chase this anymore because I know it's not a part of the program.
Right. Every record sounds different. Every approach is different. That is not the avenue for this one. Let's try here. And, you keep doing that over and over, and that like what's going to work, that horizon is going to get smaller until you're like, yes, here, this is the people that this resonates with. These are the outlets that this resonates with. Yeah.
And some of that is like, there's always been, for me, I've had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder for a wide variety of reasons about sort of my place in the industry. And a great memory that I have to sort of illuminate that is we were playing on Kayamo, which is a really cool songwriter cruise. And we were like, middle of the bill, and this very successful Nashville songwriter, more of a songwriter than an artist, happened to be on the boat sort of as a special guest. She came to one of our shows afterwards. She was like, you guys are so awesome. I would love to come see y'all play. When y'all play like the Basement or Third and Lindsley, where's your next show in Nashville? And I was like, it's actually in 3 weeks of the Ryman, and it's been sold out for 3 months. So I don't have any more tickets. But she was like, wait, what? You guys play the Ryman? And I was like, yeah, yep. I'm not trying to like, she wasn't trying to offend me or anything.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But she didn't know who we were. And we've always had a lot more fans than we have had press. You'd certainly rather have that than the opposite, because I've had friends who have had all the press in the world that can't sell tickets. You'd prefer to have both, right?
Yes.
So you just sometimes have to laugh and go, I guess I'd rather be in the position that I'm in, but sometimes it's a little awkward when moments like that happen, and you just gotta go, well, keep carrying on.
Well, it's such a balance of ego and also like actually having a career that can sustain and feed your family. I think about that all the time, because I'm going to be real honest. I'm the opposite of like, I've been reviewed in the New York Times 2 times. I've been featured in the New York Times multiple times. My resume of press is pretty incredible. Other than late night TV, I would definitely be playing the OG Basement. And I really value my career and what I have, and I am able to sustain a livelihood. But at the end of the day, the press is just an ego stroke. In today's world, it doesn't always translate. I have multiple friends who can sell out Red Rocks and sell out the Ryman and have never been written up to the degree that I have. And I'm like, I'd like a little more of that.
Yeah, like, can we do a little crisscross?
Yeah. Meet in the middle of both of these. Yeah.
Because also
Totally.
like a New York Times review or NPR or whatever, like it makes you feel good. It's like a sugar high. You're like,
But they don't send you a
"Woo!"
check for it. Yeah.
Yeah.
We had somebody related to the difference between like orange soda and fresh squeezed orange juice. You get like this right up in the New York Times, and it's like, this orange crush is delicious. But, the
Writing
Nashville
a
scene is
song.
like, we love this record. And then you sell out the Ryman, and you're like, this is orange juice. This is sustaining.
Right,
Because to me,
right.
like, that shows that your music is resonating with people. Because what's happening is people are sharing the record with their friends. They're like, here, listen to this, check this out. Or conversely, like, man, I caught their show last year at the Ryman, and it was incredible. We need to go again. And they bring, 1 people turns into 3 people turn into 12.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. The interesting thing, though, is probably if you look at sort of a broad historical picture of music and money making in the history of the world, there's probably never been more musicians per capita making a living than there are now. In the sense that if you want to make a living as a musician, it's probably easier now than before. Now, it's not easy to make a killing, but social media and digital technology have lowered the costs and raised the access. I met a guy the other day that I didn't even know he made music. He's a piano player and a session guy. And he and his wife make music for Sync. And I looked at his Spotify and I was like, oh my gosh. Like, he's like, yeah, we've never done a show, but we've had like 4 or 5 really big syncs, and these songs, one song's got 100 million plays on Spotify.
Wow.
I'm like, that's a lot of money if you own that song. And it's not a known entity. It has neither press nor fans, but it has tons of streams. The song connected with people on this massive commercial platform. It's interesting because there's a lot of ways to do it. There's not a way, there's not a path. Everybody's got their own path, and I think that's cool.
And taking away the judgment, I think, of like, okay, I'm selling tickets, but people don't know my name when I walk down the street. But obviously some people know your name because they're buying tickets. But within the like clout of the industry, I think these conversations are so helpful to remember.
Well, to like remember that we all have our work.
Yes.
Right? We all have our path that we feel is what we're supposed to be doing. The older I get, the less comparison plays a role, and certainly the less it should play a role.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And even in terms of how we create and what we do with our time. And, some people, like Bear's a great example, Bear Reinhardt. I mean, when he's not on the road, he loves to write every day.
Mm-hmm.
Not because anybody's telling him to. It's just what he likes to do. Me, I'd rather go, throw the baseball. Like we all have different ways that sort of spur and give us the life that we want. And so the worst thing we can do is to look at somebody else's life and be like, that's what my life should look like. I don't know. You're going to get lost if you try that path.
Yeah, absolutely. I always try to relate it to like, if you judge a squirrel on how well it's a deer, it's going to look horrible. But if you try to watch a deer climb a tree, it's not going to be great.
That'd make a great Instagram reel.
Also because, we've also been together 18 years. So I hear this metaphor from him, but like the animals change every time. So there should be an Instagram account of different animals.
Him doing the same metaphor, but different. Yeah.
Yeah.
Busted.
But I remember what I was going to say, though, of like how there are so many different paths. It's also a good reminder of betting on yourself and having the long view of building your own life, of why, not chasing the big firms or chasing the record deals. That might not be for everybody, because there's so much value in also owning your own work. I feel like this conversation is going into like all of the ways that I've messed up in my career so far. Like, I don't own any of my records. And I just got out of my record deal with Yep Rock, which was a great little label run by wonderful people. But ultimately I was like, man, and honestly, having kids changed it for me, that I was like, am I going to go through this life and not own any of the work that I made? Yes, I wrote those songs, but like I put my blood, sweat, and tears into the recording of those records. And we made my most recent record that I haven't put out yet in this studio that Aaron built with his dad, designed and built himself, and he produced it. And for a small amount of money, I can't let somebody else own that for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
You got to figure out what feels good for you, and also know the consequences of that might mean that I'm not invited to certain industry parties and circles, and what is of more value to you, essentially.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we know you're getting over the flu, so we don't want to totally co-opt all your energy for the day. But we love to kind of wrap up our conversations with basically one of two questions: choose your own adventure, being either something that somebody has told you along the way that like kind of resonates with you still, is kind of always in the back of your head, or conversely, like something you would tell younger you that was just getting started building this career on your art.
Well, I can answer the questions with the same answer, because it's something that was told to me that I now tell younger artists. And it was that the right song can do most of the work for itself and for your career. I wish that I had spent more time in my 20s writing and chasing songs and less time chasing opportunities within the industry. Because that's what happened with me. Basically, I spent 7 years chasing and building, and it wasn't going very well. And then I finally put out a song that connected with an audience on a very broad level. And what was beautiful about the song was it was a song, I had basically spent like 3 or 4 years chasing commercial success in my songwriting, and it wasn't working. And then one night I got very sort of emotionally sort of overrun by my nieces and nephews were leaving the country with my brother-in-law and my sister to move out of the country for a few years. I just got really sad about it, and I sat down and wrote a song for them, and no thought for anything other than just like, I want to sing this song to them and tell them how much I care about them. And then recorded the song, and it sort of went popular and viral in every direction that was available to itself at that time. This is 2011. So and that song gave me a career. Yeah, I think it's focusing on the work and being true to yourself and continuing to write songs and write songs and write songs and write songs and work on the songs. That's where the thing will happen. You know, you can't force a career. It's got to be because the music connects with people. And that, to me, only comes if the songs you're writing connect with yourself. At least that's my perspective. There are other people that have done very well, probably taking a different route, but that's what worked for me. And I still sort of, every time I write a song, I think through that, like, let the song do the work.
I love the awareness of, like, that's what worked for me. You know, that's the beauty of how we've been able to have 111 of these conversations, is that, you know, when people that we've noticed that have had careers as long as yours understand, like, this is what works for me, but there are 1,000 different outlets. Like you said a few times through here, like leaning into yours, leaning into what is yours, or what works for you, what works for your audience and your community that you create around your music.
Well, and ties back to the earlier conversation of that song came from a place where you were thinking about your own feelings, but you were thinking about the very specific audience for that song, of that it was for certain people in your life, which I love those stories because it makes me feel like there is a groundedness in love and human connection that then translates to building a life that financially sustainable. All that stuff is really nice, and not feeding the idea of you have to be so maneuvering and focused on the business aspect.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
Well, Drew, thanks for taking an hour out of your morning to sit with us and chat.
Yeah, y'all too. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Good to see y'all.
All right. You take care. Have a great day.
All right. You too. See you later.
Thank you to all of you who subscribe to our Patreon or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get our show. If you haven't subscribed yet, take a second to do that right now, and we'll see you back here next week.